Welcome everyone, and welcome to Ottawa, and just welcoming everyone to this is our second webinar that NWAC is hosting today, and I'm just going to be introducing myself. My name is Gail Gallagher. I'm a senior manager. My department I manage is violence prevention and safety, and one of the projects I'm working on is called Project Peace, and I'll be going over this presentation and going over PowerPoint. So I just also want to recognize traditional Algonquin territory that we're on. And I'm Gail Gallagher. I'm First Nation Cree from Frog Lake, Alberta. And shout out to my Reds. Hi everyone back home if you're watching. And I work at NWAC. I just want to talk about NWAC is one of the 5 national Aboriginal organizations here in Ottawa. And we've been around since 1974. And we are the national voice for Aboriginal women across Canada, representing First Nation and Métis women. And we promote Aboriginal women's rights, and we fight for equality of Aboriginal women in our society. So the purpose of the webinar today is we're looking for recommendations or feedback because we are developing a toolkit through the project. And the topic is perceptions of safety and issues of violence. So this is what the toolkit is going to be developed for. And recently, this past year, NWAC actually did develop another toolkit, which is developed by my colleague. It's called You Are Not Alone. It's actually posted on our website. So it'll probably be very similar to that. So if you don't know what a toolkit is, it's a resource guide for Aboriginal women that are looking to escape domestic violence. So if you need some ideas on what a toolkit is or a guide, just look at that. And so basically I'll just probably just jump right into the presentation. But before that, I just want to let you know that this session is being recorded. So it will be available at a later time, probably today or tomorrow, probably through Nation Talk. But we're actually posting it on our NWAC website. And also both PowerPoints. We actually did a webinar this morning for Aboriginal women, and this one is for Aboriginal men. But if you are an Aboriginal woman and you're still listening in, that's totally fine as well. And there'll be an opportunity if you want to chat later and ask some questions, feel free to do that as well, okay? And I will be reviewing some other questions later on as well. So we'll just jump right into the presentation if you don't mind. So we're going to be talking about what Project Peace is. So the acronym stands for Prevention, Education, Action, and Change. And we actually get our funding from the Status of Women from the federal government. And it is a 3-year project, but I will be talking about that later. But I'm just overviewing like what we're going to be talking about in this presentation. So I'll be talking about national surveys we've done with Aboriginal men and boys. And I'll be talking about national focus groups we've also done with Aboriginal men and boys, and then also a conclusion wrap up at the end. So Project Peace is, the acronym is for Prevention, Education, Action, and Change. And Project Peace aims solely to promote safety, violence prevention, and solution-based approaches for Aboriginal women and girls through engagement processes. So this project is a 3-year project. And it was conceived with the goal of creating safety nets for Aboriginal women and girls to enable their success across all platforms of life. And our toolkit is our goal at the end of this project. And our aim is to support Aboriginal women and girls in achieving their personal and professional life goals and ambitions by empowering service providers and also empowering Aboriginal men and women. So there will be two toolkits develop, one for Aboriginal men and boys and one for Aboriginal women and girls. So moving along, as you know, probably know, domestic violence is a huge issue in Aboriginal communities. And there's also the issue of missing and murdered Aboriginal women. So we do follow the RCMP reports of missing and murdered Aboriginal women, which is 1,181. And yes, it's a serious issue. And so Aboriginal women are 8 times more likely to be killed than non-Aboriginal women. and our rates of spousal assault are more than 3 times higher than non-Aboriginal women. And oftentimes, the spouse is not necessarily Aboriginal. And there's more severe and potentially life-threatening forms of spousal violence, 54% versus 30% of non-Aboriginal women. So, um, talking about the survey, what we did was we did use SurveyMonkey, and we did send it out probably the end of March. We just closed off the SurveyMonkey in probably July, so it was out there for a few months, and it basically went coast to coast. We did receive a lot of really good feedback, and I'd like to thank everyone that participated in our survey and contributed to the success of this project. So when we did look at the surveys for Aboriginal men and boys, these are the 9 themes that came out from everyone's feedback. There were a series of questions that were mandatory questions, and then we had some open-ended questions at the end of the survey. And the men's survey was shorter than the women's survey. The women's survey had 19 questions, and I believe the men had 14 survey questions. So these are the 9 themes that came out from the surveys. So the first one was state-imposed violence and federal policies. And that covered a wide range from police brutality and a justice system that prejudiced Aboriginal women and peoples, the 60s scoop, Indian residential schools, and the Indian Act that discriminates against Aboriginal women. And the second theme was intergenerational and other traumas like post-traumatic stress disorder. And this theme related to intergenerational trauma, mostly resulting from Indian residential schools, and also numerous other types of abuse like foster care and post-traumatic stress disorder. So this seemed to be quite a theme that was brought up quite often during our discussions and during the survey. The third one was lack of supports and barriers, social, financial, and family. So this theme relates to a lack of social, financial, and family support and barriers that prevent Aboriginal women from avoiding and or escaping violence. And oppressive structures was also another theme that related to oppressive structures such as racism, misogyny, sexism, and heteronormativity. Another theme that came out was skills, education, and awareness. So this theme related to skills such as parenting, financial, and marketable skills. So education refers to a lack of formal education as well as knowledge about laws and resources. So also in the survey, people talked about an awareness that related to a lack of understanding of how to escape violent situations and what supports and resources are available to assist Aboriginal women and families. And the final theme that came out of the survey responses was self-perception and empowerment. So this theme relates to issues such as low self-esteem, negative self-thought, fear, and the importance of empowering Aboriginal women in order to avoid violence. So we had a good response from the survey. But the focus of today's webinar is mostly to do with we want to solicit recommendations and feedback on what you would like to see in a toolkit. So I'll be focusing on that more. But I just thought it'd be useful to talk about some of the surveys. So we had 539 respondents, and 523 were English and 16 were French. So in the final completed surveys, we ended up with 401 surveys, completed qualifying surveys. So with the National Survey for Aboriginal Men and Boys, there were 4 options for people to identify with their Aboriginal identity. So that would have been First Nation, which included status and non-status, Métis, Inuit, and other. And other was a category for non-Aboriginals. So if somebody identified at the beginning of the survey that they were non-Aboriginal, automatically they would not be able to proceed because we were only interested in collecting Aboriginal respondents at this point. So going on to gender identity. So that's kind of self-explanatory. We did have 19% males that responded to the survey and 81% were female survey respondents. So the next chart shows just a breakdown of the male-female gender breakdown. And here the next slide is a combination of both male and female and the age breakdown. So that's self-explanatory as well. Won't go into that too much. The next slide also shows a breakdown of male, female, based on gender and age group as well. And then we also looked at residency. So 52% were in urban centers, and the rest is a breakdown of Métis and on reserve as well. And the next slide shows a breakdown for male and female and based on location. So we had a very high number respondents that responded from Aboriginal, from urban centers, but that were Aboriginal. Okay, so going into the MINS analysis, so once a respondent indicated they identified as a male and did not identify with any male, female, or transgender identities, they were directed to a lesser amount of questions, that's what I mentioned earlier, that focus on their perceptions of safety and violence for Aboriginal women. So there were 75 male respondents representing 90% of overall respondents. And so what we talked about was their role, or what they talked about was their roles in addressing violence was also queried along with their thoughts regarding how to make communities and neighborhoods safer for Aboriginal women. So the majority of male respondents were 18 to 30. And again, this is a combination of male and female. I'm not going to go over this too much. You could read this later, but it's just, some background information. So I'm just going to skip the next slide too as well for the survey. For question 24, when asked about how long they lived in their community or neighborhood, the majority of men indicated years, while the second most amount indicated all my life. So these responses indicate a substantial amount of experience living in their communities and therefore increases the reliability of perceptions of safety and violence for Aboriginal women. So regarding how safe communities and neighborhoods are during the week, including nights for Aboriginal women, most men felt that the areas are somewhat safe, 40, with the second most response being quite safe, 27, and the least amount of men responding that the areas were not safe at all, 11. So these responses or percentages are somewhat aligned with the responses provided by the female responses regarding feelings of general safety in their communities. And it suggests that the perceptions of safety in neighborhoods is similar for both genders. So they were quite similar for both genders. I'm going to skip over this 26 and just jump right into the open-ended questions for note for the question number 27, 28. So this allowed respondents to choose more than one answer. So these percentages reflected the most common responses and actions, and do not indicate that one action that a male respondent would take. So basically they had more than one choice. So with respect to the roles that Aboriginal men play in reducing violence against Aboriginal women, most of the male respondents felt they had an active role in this endeavor, whether through acting as a role model or openly stating they are against violence against Aboriginal women. So 0 men indicated none of the above. Only a small minority of men felt that they were unsure about what to do to reduce this. And so as I said, this PowerPoint will be available at the end as well. So these are some of the responses from the Aboriginal men about why they believe or what they feel that they can do to help Aboriginal women. So these are just some of the responses we received. Okay, so for the next slide, question 28, regarding what they would do if they encountered a woman involved in a violent situation. Again, the majority of male respondents felt they played an active role in addressing the situation. So most male respondents would call the police if they're able to, 46, or try to resolve the situations themselves, 34. Yeah, so that's kind of self-explanatory as well. And the next slide talks about the overwhelming majority of men agree that violence is a learned behavior. 63 had responded, with only 2 respondents disagreeing with the statement. And regarding the power of physical abuse as a tool that men use to assert control over Aboriginal women, almost half of the male respondents agree, 36, while 22 or 23% or 23 men strongly agree. So these responses suggest that there are systematic issues related to violence against Aboriginal women, with the recognition of this issue to be prevalent in Aboriginal communities amongst male populations. And question 31 provided an opportunity for providing multiple answers regarding what men feared the most when it came to violence against Aboriginal women. So unlike female responses, male responses seem to be almost equal for all violent events that could happen to Aboriginal women, with physical assault by a partner, sexual assault, and murder, ranking amongst the highest response counts. So interesting, these responses should suggest that Aboriginal men respondents fear murder at a higher rate than Aboriginal women. Again, actually this is PowerPoint's a little bit repeating itself, so we'll skip this slide because I already covered the themes of the surveys. So for the thematic analysis for Min's question, what do you think are the factors that contribute to family violence? So these are some of the things that male respondents identified. Many of the same themes as female respondents when queried about the contributing factors for family violence. So some of their individual responses were lack of supports and barriers, unemployment, poverty, marginalization, major socioeconomic inequalities. And again, the male respondents echoed female respondents in that the vast majority of responses indicate that poverty is a leading cause of family violence in the lives of Aboriginal women. So forced poverty, intergenerational poverty, low income, no money, and poverty in general consistently presented as a factor in violence and violent situations. Okay, so we already covered the themes. So this is just a one of the couple of examples I just decided to expand on for one of the themes in the survey was reference to health. So these are some of the things they said was stress, alcohol and drugs, mental problems, anger problems, and the overwhelming majority indicate that alcohol and drugs are the leading factors in family violence against Aboriginal women. So these responses related to both men and women. And also another survey theme was skills, education, awareness. So it all starts from learning and seeing it as a child, and lack of education, history, a cycle in families, and many respondents indicated that violence is a learned behavior and is often viewed as normal, and therefore education awareness is necessary to combat family violence experienced by Aboriginal women. And many respondents mentioned that the residential schools, because due to its history of abuse towards Aboriginal children, that it kind of created a history or a normalization of violence in our culture, in our society. Okay, so I'll be talking about the focus groups now. And so what we did was my work colleague Tanya and myself, we did a series of focus groups all across Canada. So focus groups are basically like research, and we went into various Aboriginal communities across Canada. So there was a total of 18 focus groups, and they were in Winnipeg, Manitoba, Selkirk, Manitoba, Vancouver, BC, Squamish, BC, Whitehorse, Yukon, Carcross, Yukon, Halifax, Nova Scotia, Shubenacadie, Nova Scotia, and we held 2 in Montreal, Quebec for both Aboriginal men and Aboriginal women. So these focus groups were carried out in urban and rural settings, and the age group of the participants ranged in ages from 18 to 55 years and older. We did have some youth participation as well. And at this point too, I believe I forgot to mention that our funding does come from Status Women for the federal government, and that is how we're operating this project. So our focus groups ran from 1.5 to 2.5 hours long. And in the focus groups, it's very important to note that participants felt that the need to discuss the historical violence in Canadian society that still continues today before they want to discuss what was needed for the toolkits. For example, in the focus group discussions, we did hear there's a lot of incidences of racism in our society as well towards Aboriginal people. And many participants wanted additional or new resources and services to protect and stop the violence against Aboriginal women and girls. And we heard in some First Nation communities that there isn't even any women's shelters or um, tra- uh, transitional houses in some communities, which is not good at all, especially if a woman is trying to escape a domestic violence situation. So, um, so many focus group participants identified drugs and alcohol abuse as one of the major causes of violent behavior in Aboriginal communities. So, so I'm just going to talk about our focus groups and some of the feedback that we heard, which is really important to stress that this is some of the feedback and recommendations that people, Aboriginal participants in our focus groups provided that they wanted to hear in, or what they want to see in our resource toolkit. So in the south, which would be, actually no, sorry, the first one is the west, which would be BC, Saskatchewan, and Alberta. That's the region. So in the west, they talked about they would like to see a picture of a sweat lodge, and they said just a image of an eagle feather says a lot, and a resource page where people can go for spiritual healing or teachings like a sweat lodge ceremonies. And they also wanted to hear about prevention information about gangs. And what they also wanted included in the toolkit would be traditional teachings like the seven grandfather teachings and the medicine wheel. Also, what they would like to see in a toolkit in the West, they talked about role models for young males, like a Big Brother program, role models for young females, and spiritual guidance that's knowledgeable and respected elders they would like to see included. They would also like to have included cultural teachings that walk the red road that would be included in this toolkit, and awareness programs of what lies ahead as they don't have the tools to see it yet. Um, in the West, they talked about some feedback we heard about the toolkit was they would like to have individuals who are administering the toolkits have to be trained in a certain way to have a better outcome. They need to have a proper training in order to reach our people in the right way. So just really considering the cultural aspect and component of it as well. And it's important to involve the youth and perhaps a National Indigenous Convention Week to introduce the toolkits like well in advance in, for example, 2 years in advance. So in the South, which would have been Manitoba, Ontario, and Quebec, we heard the feedback we heard that they would like to see in the toolkits was to include something about sports because it's going to involve not only our men but also our boys. It's best to combine the men and women's groups because it's better, you have more ideas that way. And the hardest part is talking to community members. Those are the ones who have the most to say. They also suggested utilization of apps, internet sites that include sites that have videos explaining what their program is designed to do, how to empower people, and to get healthy. So they want to have phone lines for people to call in when they're feeling a certain way, and also offices to go to in certain cities. So in the East, that would have been PEI, Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, Labrador, and Newfoundland. So some of the things we heard from the East was the toolkits have been mostly focused on women and rarely does it include a male's perspective, and lack of resources for abused men because men usually have a harder time opening up with personal issues. And in the North, which would have been Yukon and NWT, there was no input from this area, from the men's focus group. But that doesn't mean that you still can't provide a feedback. You can still email your suggestions and your feedback on what you would like to see in a toolkit. So you can email to myself at ggaal or ggallagher at NWAC.ca, and it'll be posted here on the website. So if we have any questions, I'll be happy to answer them now, but we're just going to take a short little break and I'll check my emails. We'll be back right online in probably 30 seconds or a minute. So stay right there. Stay tuned. Okay, so some of the questions that came up, actually these are some of the questions we thought they're kind of a repeat from this morning, but when will the toolkits be done? and we are estimating they'll be done by end of January 2016. And what's going to be happening is we need to pilot test these toolkits. So we'll be going out again to various First Nation communities across Canada and pilot testing these toolkits. So if you would like your First Nation community or Aboriginal community to be included, please email me at NWAC, and we'll make sure or try to include you at least, because there's a number of factors that come into it, our budget and distance and all that stuff, but we try our best to get out to as many communities as possible, depending on our budget. And what we're going to be doing is pilot testing between January and March of 2016. And the final toolkit will be available by the end of 2016. And I believe that was it, except I really want to stress there's still an opportunity for feedback. This webinar will be available for viewing later on. If you missed the webinar, or if your friend missed the webinar, you can still share it at a later date. And will be posted on our NWAC website and also the PowerPoints as well. And we'll also have a bilingual version as well. So thank you very much. It's really great to have the participation and involvement. And if you have any questions, you can still email me your questions at my address provided on the screen. And hi, thank you very much.